Hello, my name is Steve Tilson. I was going to talk to you a little bit about the Viet Nam War. This is a moment in our history which has, of course, has acquired a very large significance. It is still, in some senses and to some degree or other, controversial. People have very different opinions about its significance. It seems to me that we are only now, 30, 40 years later, beginning to have the kind of perspective that it takes to have a good historical view of these kinds of events. But start with a little bit of context here. Vietnam, Southeast Asia, of course, has a very long, very complicated history, like all areas of the world do. We don't have to go into that. Cultures grew up there, different specific cultures, different points in time, heavily influenced, culturally influenced by China, of course, through the centuries. I wanted to go back and look at the late 19th century. This was a period of time when the industrializing countries in Europe, the big European powers, the emerging powers in Europe, were competing fiercely in all kinds of ways. One of the major arenas in which they were competing was in collecting colonial possessions. All of them were engaged in this to some degree or other. Of course, the British started out with a huge empire. They had a big edge on everybody. That was, in fact, the late 19th century was sort of the peak in most respects of British colonial and imperial power. The sun never sets on the British Empire, was the saying. And it was fairly literally true. They had possessions all the way around the world. But the other European powers, as I say, were also engaged in this, and they were all out gathering up colonial possessions wherever and whenever they could. Southeast Asia specifically fell under French control. And in fact, much of what we think of as Southeast Asia, all of Vietnam, Laos, a lot of Cambodia, parts of Thailand, by the end of the 19th century had sort of been gradually, piece by piece, snapped up by the French. It was called French Indochina. And it was as I say, it was a major portion of the French colonial empire. They had possessions in other parts of the world, but French Indochina was a very productive, very lucrative place for them. They made a lot of profit out of there. They harvested various kinds of crops and commodities and things, and so it was important to them. The French remained in control. We might mention here what happened culturally, economically, politically in Southeast Asia during the era of French control, sort of typical of colonial situations everywhere. The great mass of the population, of course, were fairly poor, peasants, overwhelmingly Buddhist. But what developed during the time of French dominance was gradually there developed a small elite, an aristocracy, if you will, of Southeast Asian people who became sort of the governing structure. The French were always there. They were the owners. They were the controllers, the masters. But there was an Asian elite. They were very Francophile. They spoke French, they read French books, they dressed in Western clothes, they were Catholic. They sent their sons to Paris to be educated. And they had gradually become very distinct from, as I say, the great mass of the population, which remained mostly peasants and mostly Buddhist. Things went that way until 1940. In 1940, you may recall, at the beginning of World War II, the Germans invaded France. They conquered France. France surrendered, capitulated to the Germans. The Germans thereupon created basically two Frances, if you will. The northern part of France, the most heavily industrialized part of France, the Germans directly occupied and kept under their direct control. The southern part, most of France actually, was they created a new government. It was based in the city of Vichy, so it became known as Vichy France. Officially, legally, it was an independent country, but functionally it was a Nazi puppet state. Basically, they did what the Germans said. There was a very direct reason for this. The Germans kept into their direct custody a couple of 100,000 French POWs. And so everybody knew that if the Vichy French got out of line, the Germans were quite likely to start shooting prisoners. So, Vichy France as a German puppet state, the Germans of course were allies of the Japanese. And so in 1940, the Vichy French signed an agreement with the emerging Japanese government, militaristic government, and basically the Japanese marched into what had been French Indochina and took control of it. And French Indochina, including Vietnam, was occupied by the Japanese throughout the Second World War. As in lots and lots of other places, a resistance movement grew up in Southeast Asia against Japanese occupation. In Southeast Asia, this anti-Japanese resistance movement was not as big or as well organized as it was in other parts of Asia, for example, the Philippines. But there was this movement, and a number of different groups were involved in it. A leader of this resistance movement was a man named Ho Chi Minh. Now, Ho was educated, reasonably well educated. He had gone to France. He had lived in France, actually, for a number of years as a young man. He had gotten some education. He had also picked up on socialism. And he had become a socialist and eventually a communist. But during the Second World War, as I say, he was back in Southeast Asia, in Vietnam, and he was involved in the resistance movement against the Japanese. Now, in 1945, of course, the Japanese pulled out at the end of the Second World War. When that happened, the French, in full expectation and assumption that they would simply come right back and pick up where they had left off and take over running things in Southeast Asia, the French came right back. The people in Southeast Asia, the indigenous people, the Asian people, turns out weren't all that happy about that. And so, as it happened in a number of other places, actually, the resistance movement against the Japanese occupation fairly seamlessly segued into an anti-French independence movement. And the French found themselves in a nasty little guerrilla war there in Southeast Asia, which went on for almost a decade. The French mounted a very large effort against this. They got, by the way, a fair amount of military support in terms of material and things like that from the United States, because the independence movement had already taken on a decided leftist communist tinge. So we were helping the French out, but the War of National Liberation in Vietnam eventually reached its height in 1954. Whoops. At a place called Dien Bien Phu, the last sizable French force in Vietnam, interestingly a French Foreign Legion force, was surrounded and besieged and eventually surrendered to the nationalist forces. And so the French had been chased out of Vietnam. Now, the question emerged very quickly, of course, okay, what happens now? And the situation was rather uncertain and unclear. Nobody knew exactly what to do. But what was arrived at was an agreement, one of those fateful agreements that political leaders seem to tend to want to do in situations like this. They drew a line on the map. In Korea, we drew a line to 38th parallel. In Southeast Asia, it was the 17th parallel, the 17th degree of latitude. And Vietnam was divided into two regions. The understanding in 1954, when this agreement was reached, the understanding was that this was to be only temporary, that there were to be national elections, a big plebiscite, and the people themselves, the people of Vietnam, would decide what government they wanted. What happened, of course, was not that. What happened was that those elections never really took place, and two countries, North Vietnam and South Vietnam, gradually emerged. North Vietnam, controlled by a communist government heavily dependent on the Chinese communists and to a certain extent the Russians for support. The South Vietnam, controlled by a government largely made up of the old French colonial elite, that is Vietnamese people, but heavily westernized, French-speaking Catholic, and not in close touch with the great majority of the population. The situation was very uneasy from the very beginning, of course, as one might understand and expect. There was tension between the two countries. A lot of people in both areas sincerely wanted to see the country reunited. They resented this division of their country and they wanted to see all of Vietnamese people back together. But of course that raised some questions about under which government and what kind of government. So things were tense. A kind of low-scale guerrilla war sort of grew up. There was some fighting. As I say, the French had been chased out. The pressure was on the United States to step in and take a more active role. An interesting development here. This was when John Kennedy took office in 1961. He fairly quickly came into the situation. And under this pressure, the French particularly putting pressure on the United States to intervene and step in and take a more active role. Kennedy resisted it for the most part. He sent in some people. They were called advisors and training people. Eventually he sent his Green Berets in slowly increasing numbers. Eventually there were 15 or 16,000 American personnel in South Vietnam. In November of 1963, John Kennedy was assassinated. He was succeeded by his Vice President, Lyndon Johnson. LBJ, an interesting character, Lyndon Johnson. A throwback in some senses. He was nominated to be John Kennedy's vice president. In some sense, this is kind of a standard strategy for American political theory. If you have a presidential candidate who tends to be sort of one kind of figure, it's very often the case that the party will figure, well, let's have as a VP somebody who's rather different so we can pull a few more different votes from different groups. Johnson was a Southerner, an old New Dealer, an old-style politician, that is a face-to-face politician. Not terribly charismatic, not a great public figure, not the kind of glamorous Camelot figure that John Kennedy had been. A very astute man politically, but he was caught in an interesting situation, an unpleasant situation for him. As I mentioned, he was rather, by personal philosophy, he was rather an old-style New Dealer. He wanted to focus on domestic things. He in particular wanted to focus on the civil rights movement. Somewhat surprisingly, perhaps from a white Southerner. But in this sense, he was actually fairly effective. Lyndon Johnson was the leader in the political side of the civil rights movement that really put the civil rights movement on the map. And he oversaw the passage of a number of pieces of legislation that put the civil rights movement front and center and marked a number of very significant accomplishments and achievements in that area. However, at the same time, Johnson was very fearful, as Democrats in this period had to be, very fearful of being seen as soft on communism. So, he eventually, and at first gradually, began to send in more people. Not regular troops at first, but advisors, trainers, again, the Green Berets. Then in 1964, some of these Some of these new units that Johnson was sending in were naval units, naval vessels. In 1964, there was an incident in the Tonkin Gulf, which is basically the ocean right off the coast of Vietnam, when it was kind of a confused situation. An American destroyer was fired on by North Vietnamese patrol boats, or maybe it was the other way around. There's still controversy about exactly what happened that night. At any rate, there was an incident. Fire was exchanged between this American naval vessel and North Vietnamese ships or patrol boats. Johnson used this as a pretext. He went to Congress and asked for the authority to commit regular ground troops. And he got it. This was the Tonkin Gulf Resolution. This had to happen this way because, by the way, the Constitution says that the president can declare war, but he can only do it, he can ask Congress to declare war. The president cannot declare war. That takes an act of Congress. To commit American military forces takes an act of Congress. And so anything short of an act of war requires some kind of resolution like this, which is what Johnson wanted, and it's what he got. With the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, Johnson had the go-ahead to do what he wanted to do, and he did so. The word that was used was escalation. Escalation. What that referred to was Lyndon Johnson gradually committing more and more American ground forces to South Vietnam. The situation in South Vietnam was complicated. The last time that significant numbers of American military personnel had been involved in a combat situation was in Korea. Korea was a very different environment, a very different kind of conflict. The Korean War was, for all practical purposes, it was a conventional war. Ground forces fighting each other in battles. Vietnam was a guerrilla war. Very different kind of environment, very different kind of situation. It presented a whole very different, very unaccustomed kind of environment and set of issues and problems that the American military, to be quite frank, were simply not prepared to deal with very well. The response was to send in more troops and more troops and more troops. By 1968, there were over 5 million American soldiers in South Vietnam. Massive amounts of American military material being poured into the country. By this time, the standard that was being used was the body count. How many communist Viet Cong was the South Vietnamese name for the forces that were fighting against the South Vietnamese government and the American forces. How many VC did we get today? And by 1968, the Johnson administration, Johnson was looking at the possibility of running for re-election, of course. So he staked a lot of his credibility on success in South Vietnam. So they loudly proclaimed that we were very near success, that we were killing lots of Viet Cong, and it was almost over, and success was just around the corner. And then in 1968, at the ancient Buddhist holiday of Tet, the Buddhist New Year, the Tet, the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces, which came in to support them, launched a major offensive. The Tet Offensive was a turning point in the Vietnam War and to a significant point, I think, a turning point in the history of our country. Up to that point, the Johnson administration and people who were in support of our involvement in Southeast Asia had been enjoying a high level of credibility. Lots of people assumed that, yeah, it's kind of a mess, but it's almost over. The Tet Offensive demonstrated in very concrete ways, no, it's not over, and we're not that close to success. The actual military achievements for the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese were very limited. They did mount attacks over a very wide area throughout South Vietnam. They occupied a number of cities briefly. They didn't hold them for very long. As I say, the actual long-term concrete military achievements were quite limited, quite minimal. But that wasn't the important point. The Tet Offensive resulted in a huge loss of credibility for the Johnson administration and the whole pro-war position in this country. Not long after the Tet Offensive, in recognition of that the political situation had changed dramatically, Johnson announced that he would not run for re-election in 1968. The Democrats nominated Hubert Humphrey, a well-known liberal from Minnesota. The Republicans nominated Richard Nixon again, as they had back in 1960 when Kennedy ran. Nixon and the Republican campaign focused on winning the vote and the support of people in the country who were very dismayed by what was happening in Southeast Asia, but even more were becoming increasingly uneasy about what they saw as this growing and increasingly radical anti-war movement in the country. George Wallace split off some of the ultra-conservatives. He ran as a third-party candidate, but Richard Nixon handily won election in 1968. And he came to the White House with his #1 priority. He knew very well, you can say all kinds of things about Dick Nixon, but he was not stupid. And he realized in 1968 that his #1 priority had to be to get us out of Southeast Asia. So he set about doing it. Initially, by a renewed military effort, we dropped more bombs from 1968 to 1972 in Southeast Asia than we had dropped in all of World War II. Huge, huge bombing campaigns. And they spread out over larger areas. We were bombing North Vietnam heavily. We started bombing in Cambodia. All of these steps resulted in responses by the emerging anti-war movement in the country, which was becoming stronger, much more vocal, more articulate. Nixon announced the Vietnamization policy, in which American ground forces would gradually start to be withdrawn, and the burden of fighting the war would be given back to the South Vietnamese. He put the best possible spin on it that he could. What it amounted to, of course, was we were getting out. And we did. Long, slow, gradual, bloody process. But in 1972, after a last convulsive heavy wave of bombing, in which the harbor of Haiphong, the port city of Hanoi, the capital of North Vietnam, the harbor was mined from the air, and heavy bombing campaign all over the rest of the country. In 1973, early 1973, the last U.S. troops left South Vietnam. Thank you.